All right, you're really going to enjoy this conversation. I loved this conversation with my good friend Curt Francom from Leading Saints. We talk about grace and works, guilt and shame. Does God have expectations of you? Just a really solid, good discussion here that I think you're going to enjoy. Before we get started, I want to talk again about the Gospel on the Nile. This is the tour that I do with Bruce Porter. This is coming up in September, from September 10th to September 19th. I would love to see you on this trip. This is a trip where you learn so much about the gospel, the ritual embrace, the Abrahamic covenant, the royal procession. You will never see the temple the same again. Again, this is Gospel on the Nile. This is September 10th to 19th, 2024. Go to cwicmedia.com. That's cwicmedia.com. Go to trips and events and scroll down to Gospel on the Nile. Would love to see you there. Here we go. All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. On this episode, we have brought back my good friend Curt Francom from Leading Saints. Welcome, Curt.
Hey, Greg, it's good to be back. I always appreciate the invitation. These are fun conversations.
Yeah, well, this one's going to be fun too. Overall umbrella approach to what we're about to talk about. You've come out with a book here called Is God Disappointed in Me? Removing Shame from a Gospel of Grace. I view, and I talk about this a lot on the podcast, but I view the church having kind of a pendulum that swings back and forth. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the pendulum for the longest time was hanging over on the side of works, mm-hmm. your checklist. Are you doing enough? I mean, you know, digging into the heritage of the pioneers who were pulling and overcoming every possible horrible thing, right?
Right.
But to me, it seems that we've gone to this pendulum has swung all the way over to the other side, where we're very grace heavy, at least in, you know, I don't know about our necessarily yet in our let's call it our Sunday school lessons, but culturally. It seems to me that, and messages that are sent out there, it seems to me like we've gone over to that side of grace. Do you see it that way? And if so, is that good? And if you don't see it that way, where is it wrong?
Yeah. So it's funny you bring up the pendulum example, because I talk about a pendulum example in my book called The Gospel Continuum, where we have grace on one side, you know, the love of God on one side, works on the other side, justice, or, you know, all the behaviors that are maybe expected of us to be a good Latter-day Saint. And oftentimes, and this is sort of the invitation I felt from God as I was writing this, is like, what do we do with these two extremes? Because it does feel like we can't be on both sides at the same time, or I've got to be either buy into full grace, full acceptance, full love, or I got to be the rigid, like, behaviors doing the thing. So I would completely agree with you. And I think it's more of just how we're framing it in our gospel experience. Cause I feel like, you know, you see it, you know, bless their hearts. I think of, you know, a family who's like done all the behaviors. Maybe they would frame themselves as a very orthodox home. And then that teenager comes out as LGBT or whatever it is, and suddenly it just rocks that family, and everybody escapes to the grace side. They hold on to it, they refuse to let go, and then they kind of lose their identity in it all. And again, these aren't my situations, and who knows how I would respond, but it also breaks my heart of thinking, well, you abandoned like this other side that's so beautiful and has a deeper purpose, but in our minds we misunderstand it as like, well, no, that's just, you know, those things are mean and they're too heavy. And what, you know, what happens to the mental health of my son or daughter or a family, or so we just have to stay in the love side. But I think there's so much more to understand, a better way to frame this. And it goes back to sort of the larger view of the book, and what I'm trying to do with the book is that I don't consider myself a gospel scholar, or I don't know the scriptures in and out, or I can't spout pure doctrine just without really thinking about it. But oftentimes we take a true principle, and it's not that we change the principle, but we frame it incorrectly. And we do this all the time in the church, where, you know, even like families can be together forever. Like
Mhm.
great, simple, primary principle, but we frame it in a way of like, if maybe somebody's more against the church, they'd be like, isn't that like mean that you would like cast people out of heaven and all these empty chairs in heaven, and you won't be able to see your loved ones who decided to drink coffee, in immortality? And you're like, wait a minute, like, where are you getting all that? Like you've framed a doctrine, a true doctrine, truth, in a very poor way, when in reality there's so many other ways to frame the doctrine. So I think a lot of people, this pendulum exists and they'll agree that it exists, but we frame it poorly.
Okay. So in the title here, you have removing shame from the gospel of grace. I want you to talk a little bit about guilt and shame, because you kind of focus on this and talk about how, I think this has to do with a lot of people that would feel guilt and shame. I'm going to be really honest with this. We were talking just before this in a certain exercise that we have gone through together before, but I have a harder time with this because I don't feel those things very well. I think I'm a callous, hardened heart person.
That's it, Greg. We figured you out.
I don't feel that as much as like I know my wife does. I mean, she's gonna work off of those things right there. That is like, she's going to stay as far away from that as possible. Right. And so she's going to react a lot to guilt and shame. Right. And I think a lot of people do. And it's harder for me to understand that, I guess, that where a lot of people are in that position and they're going to operate off of, hey, this is my framework. If I feel guilt and shame, I'm doing something wrong. And maybe this is now going to become a power, a feeling, a geist that is going to help me spiral downward.
Yeah. Yeah. This dichotomy of guilt and shame is interesting. And there's more and more, in the age of Brene Brown, right? There's just so much more research coming out about what shame is and how it impacts us. And we often simplify, guilt is when I do something wrong, but shame is when I feel like I'm something wrong. And to me, I guess that's not overly helpful, because I hear that, I'm like, well, what do I do with that? And so I just frame shame in a simple way of like, shame is any time that the divine identity is attacked. And you talk a lot about identity on your show, which I love. And because, it's at the core of our theology. The reason we go to a temple and be endowed is to be endowed from an identity from on high. And it's beautiful. And there's nothing shaming about that. It's only encouraging. Now, again, we can frame it incorrectly, and it can be, some people do make it a negative experience, but I guess what it led me to that subtitle of removing shame from a gospel of grace is I hear individuals that maybe leave the church, and everybody has their story, and I want to show as much empathy to the various stories, but they leave it in a state of like, the church overwhelms me, or man, I just don't feel like, there's the standards are too high, or I feel like I'm constantly broken and they don't want me and I'm just never good enough. And I'm thinking, wow, like, where did this message come from? And it really comes from this core of the attack of shame. And I truly believe that the adversary's strongest tool is shame, because it's an attack on identity. And if he can attack our identity, if he can make us believe that we're something less divine, something that would be cast out of heaven, and God is almost disgusted with us, then he can take the year off, because we'll do as much sinning as we can just to numb that feeling of I'm not good enough. And so I really wanted to try and articulate the gospel in a way of saying, no, this is extremely encouraging experience being in the gospel, extremely graceful, full of love. And it should be something that you can't help but return to every 7 days and say, please give me that sacrament. I need it. I need the covenant, because it offers me so much strength and encouragement, where other people, again, it's framed poorly, where they think, it's just so overwhelming. I just am exhausted by all this. And I really don't think anybody should feel exhausted in the gospel of Jesus Christ.
I fully agree with that. Here's a question though. And you can help me with this, hopefully. Is shame always negative?
I would argue.
I'll give you an example. Go look at some of the Asian cultures. It's like heavy shame. Right. It's like, I just watched Shogun, which was incredible, by the way. And I'm watching Shogun, and it's like, everything they do is built around honor versus shame. Mm-hmm. Right. Their whole interaction between one another. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, there are so many things I could buy into here But as a modern American, there are so many things I could never do, right?
Yeah.
It's like I cannot buy into these things. But I think about, for example, I've always been really close to my dad and really close to, I've got 3 brothers. I'm really close to my 3 brothers, right? And sometimes I think of something and I'm like, well, if I ever did that, my dad and my brothers would just be like, come on, right? Come on.
They'd razz you about
I
it.
do the same thing with my wife and kids. It's like, I can't, I feel like sometimes there is a built-in structure there. I mean, I don't know if you call it shame or what, but I can't do that. I've got a wife and kids that look up to me, not up to me necessarily, but they're like, I can't do that to them. Right. I can't put them in a position where they're like, what is dad doing?
Yeah. So, and to answer your question simply, is shame always bad? I would absolutely say yes, it is. Now, I think you're asking a different question but it works, Kurt. Like, should it be bad if it works? Like, I'll be the first to admit, shame works, Greg. Like, as a father of a bless his heart, 9-year-old boy, man, it's hard when we have church at 9:00. We got to get out the door, Greg. And there's perceptions, and I want to be on church on time. Like, I default to the sort of shame often because I need results now. The long game, it's just not effective. It's not a way, especially in a long game that's eternal, a long game where we're supposed to become something. Like, we can perceive like we're becoming something. And there's many people in the church, and sometimes that person is me, where I show up to church and it looks like, hey, Kurt's got life figured out. I mean, look at his family. Everybody's dressed nicely, but little do they know the shame that happened behind the scenes. And really, this is a higher law. I mean, as far as the law of Moses, like, yeah, there's a lot of behavior things there, but God invited us into a higher law that is based on love and acceptance and encouragement and grace. And that's the workshop that I want to step into. I think, God, you accept me completely now. Like, even if I never change today, you accept me. Like, how do I become like that? I want to learn how to love like you love. And in the long run, it is a redemptive experience.
So there's so many things that play into that. I think it's, like I think of Lehi's dream, that is a major anchor for me. And when I look through almost everything through that filter, and you think of the pointing fingers, right, from the great and spacious building of shame, looking over at the people that are partaking of the fruit at the tree of life. And many of them leave, right, because they can't handle the shame that is thrown their way. It's definitely a tool from the adversary to pull them away from the gospel. But there are... Shame is perhaps the wrong response, but there are expectations, right, that are in place. So going from all the way from the top, there is God and his expectations for us. Certainly he has expectations. I hear something, think that this came, I'm not sure, but I think this came from a popular talk radio host who said something along the lines of, if you just lower your expectations, you won't be disappointed as much.
Yeah.
Right. And was really into that. And I've heard so many people repeat that. Oh, okay, I can just lower my expectations and then I don't have the shame. I don't have the disappointment that would go along with that. Right. There is expectations. And I think that those are positive if they're ideal and true and righteous. I mean, doesn't God have expectations for us?
Oh, this is where our conversation gets fun, Greg. And again, my book, I mean, I'm not some BYU PhD or whatever. Like, it's a thought exercise, and there'll be many things.
That's really good.
There's many things in the book where people disagree, but I just want you to think about it. I could be totally wrong, but I want you to process and think about it. So I make the argument in the book that God has zero expectations in us. And you think, oh, come on, Kurt, have you ever been to church? Have you ever sat through the temple or listened to the commandments or read the word of wisdom, right? Because if we believe in a Jesus Christ who came here and that his grace was sufficient, then he fulfilled all expectation. Like, it's over, it's done. So then why all the commandments and covenants? And I believe that the commandments and covenants, they are a refining process. They are the workshop of God that God invites us into and say, you want to be like me? here's some commandments and covenants. Not because he expects you to do it or else he'll cast you off and thrust you out of heaven, but because he will invite you into a right relationship with him. I think of my, I talk about in the book about witnessing my oldest daughter walk for the first time. Like, it was this beautiful interaction of me encouraging her. And when did I have an expectation that she would run around and skip and go get a job at that point? No, because I knew that she was developing into something beautiful. I had zero expectation of her walking, so that when she fell down, I didn't think, oh, great, she messed it up. Or God doesn't see a sin and he didn't scurry around heaven and be like, oh, where's Jesus at? I got to send him down. I didn't think they'd actually sin. No, of course he knew we would sin. And he sent his son so that he could fulfill all expectation. And then God would give us covenants and commandments as a relationship, as a tool, as a workshop to step into, to refine and work through our exaltation because of Jesus Christ.
But doesn't he expect us to obey the commandments?
So the way, again, we're all framing these things. So if we believe that Jesus Christ fulfilled all expectation, why would he need to expect us to?
Well, where are we told though that Jesus Christ fulfills all expectation?
Well, so that his grace was sufficient, right? In Romans, it talks about that, and that like what Jesus did was enough. In other terms, right? Now, do we believe that? I don't know. I mean, maybe you can help me on that. But is there a gap there that we're supposed to fill, or did he fulfill all? And so that's where I'm like, if we can do the theological math of work the math of saying, all right, so what's my part? Like, okay, so Christ had this much expectation, I have this much, or how does that work? Because what if I don't live up, even though I'm trying, I'm still immortal, and I fall short of my expectation? Then what? Well, Christ can't fulfill that. So that's where I really want people to think this through, is like, if these are expectations, then where does Christ step in there? And what if I fall short? And that's why, in my mind, it works better to frame it that Jesus fulfilled all expectation. And we just have to, that's where the other side of the pendulum, of that we receive his grace, receive his redemption, and then he invites us into an exaltation experience of saying, I can't just magically make you like me, but I want to invite you into a process that does that. And so if you want to do that, yeah, sure, then you could say there's an expectation to do that. But nor is this a universal argument that, yeah, just, do whatever, no expectation, we'll just let you all in. Because that wouldn't be accurate too, because we have to become something to absorb more of his grace and love.
I guess for me, I want a God that has expectations. I want him to have expectations of me.
Why is that?
Because it's almost like it's a hope.
Mm-hmm. He
has a hope for me of what I'm going to become and where I'm going to go and what I'm going to do. And I would be, on the other end, I would be really disappointed,
right,
if he doesn't have those expectations, because if I don't know, I guess in my mind, and again, it's how we frame this, but
right,
in my mind, if he doesn't have those expectations of me, he doesn't care.
And he does have those expectations, and because of his son, they're fulfilled, right? We're on the other side of the atonement. And so then what, right? Then the reality is sometimes we want sort of that God that's a little bit disappointed in us. Like, you know what? I thought you were better. And there comes the shame in it, like, because shame works, right? It'll get us moving. It'll get us to wake up and on church on time if we perceive that our identity will be altered, right? So we're sort of, it's all, the way we define words. But at the end of the day, if God at no point says, I expect you to do this or you're something less. He loves us completely. And that's the power of his love, is that no matter how many times we mess up, no matter how many times we have to repent, he's still with us, right? Because he doesn't have to, hold space for expectation, because it's already been fulfilled through Jesus. So he can sit with us as long as it takes, because there's not that tension of the expectation. He can just continue to sit with us and say, yeah, just turn to Jesus again.
I'm going
Like
to have
you want
to think longer on that.
right. And again, this is the thought exercise, right? And I'm sure, and a lot of people turn to the Old Testament like, Kurt, like, really, there's not a disappointed God. Have you read the Old Testament, right?
Yeah.
But it just does not serve me well, does not keep me engaged in the gospel by knowing I keep messing up and I'm kind of garbage for doing that. No, it's like this God that's like, don't worry about the expectations. Just stay engaged in my commandments. Keep my commandments. And I don't necessarily like do all my commandments, but just hold on to it. Hold on to the covenant. And that's why I love our theology so much. We have a symbol that every day we put on the garment as a symbol of that covenant, a symbol of Jesus Christ saying, today's going to be tough. You're going to mess up. But whatever you do, just hold on to that covenant. Just keep it on. Just keep going, right? Rather than, well, you're kind of not worthy to put on that covenant today because I had some different expectations yesterday.
Okay. So you talk about disappointment here. I like these things being articulated, and you do that several times in the book. Here you say, this is a quote from the book, you say, disappointment is simply the transfer of shame within the boundaries of a loving relationship. So you're equating shame with disappointment here. Is that correct?
Yeah. Shame is, I guess disappointment is just what we call the transfer of shame. That's how I framed it there.
In a loving relationship.
In a loving relationship. Right. Because, the old, and we've probably heard it from our own parents. Like, I'm not mad at you, but I sure am disappointed in you. Like, that almost stings more. I'd almost rather my mom just be mad at me rather than disappointed me, because disappointment is an identity statement. Like, I thought you were something more, but now I realize you're not, right? And if I had a God who's like, I created you as my child, I thought you were my child, I guess you're not. Like, whoa, wait, don't abandon me. Don't like, that's where the shame can really be destructive, is that at any point, if we feel like our identity is not set in by or defined by God, that we're in trouble, right? Or we're always chasing this ideal identity. And this is, in the scriptures, I love, obviously Christ's baptism. Here he comes. This is my beloved son. And you can make the argument, like, nobody shouted from the banks, like, hey, wait a minute, God, he hasn't done anything yet. We're at the beginning of his ministry. He hasn't proven that. Get back to us later. Maybe he'll be beloved if he does all the things. No, like God set in the beginning the identity. Like this, he's beloved. He's my son. And he does that to us as well. I love, John 15:9 that I don't have verbatim, but basically all the ways that God loves Jesus, Jesus loves you. And so Jesus thinks you're beloved. Jesus is willing to sit with you and encourage you and knows that you have divine potential. So why would you ever give up?
You see, also on one side of things, the way we there's a cultural issue. I mean, we kind of touched on this, but there is you got like the tiger mom, right? It's like, and this is something that the tiger moms really come from. The term comes from mothers in Korea, Korean mothers, right? And I've been there. And you look around, and honestly, the place is incredible. It's spotless. Right. There's hardly any crime. The people are all really polite. It's amazing, right? Actually, when you go there, at least as a visitor. Yeah. But there's also got a high suicide rate. Yeah. And so you've got this, these two sides of this high level of expectation coming from parents. I mean, you have high school kids there that go off to boarding schools all the time, and they'll be doing their homework until midnight every night. Wow. It's really a tough, strict culture that they have. And I see some positives there, but certainly I see a number of negatives. What is the balance then? Is there a balance, or does it have nothing to do with that type of a spectrum?
Well,
is the spectrum simply your identity? Is the spectrum simply, you don't need to worry about one side or the other? It's simply remembering you're a child of God. Is there no expectation on that? Is there no anything that's going to be placed on that? What is the guiding principle?
Yeah, and this is why it's so important to go back to the beginning of our conversation to see this continuum that we're on, where God doesn't just invite us over to love to be like, great, like we're just going to, and this is where evangelical traditions come in. It seems like I just love you, and we're just gonna like hang out in heaven forever. It's just beautiful. And we're like, well, I mean, I don't want to sing hymns for eternity. I mean, I guess if that's the plan, then we'll do it, but it seems incomplete for me, right? And so then with that foundation of love, and I call it the gravity of grace, God will always pull us over to grace first and say, I want you to be sure what your identity is. You are a child of God, right? We're in nursery. That's where we're starting. You're loved completely. And anytime you need to come to me for help, I'm here to help. And then because of that grace, and this is the paradox of grace, is that when I feel completely accepted, Carl Rogers said it this way, the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I begin to change. And I would tweak it for a religious context of when I realize that Jesus or God accepts me just as I am, then I begin to change, or then I have this desire to change. And so then from this foundation of love, then we can swing over to the behaviors, the covenants, those things that are put in place, because that's the workshop where we can exalt, where we can become something. So I don't mind a drill sergeant God who's going to get on my level. I call him the eternal coach, who's like, listen, your first half was not good, and you got to change some things up. And there's many times like, okay, yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. I missed it. I fumbled there, or whatever. I'm going to give it another go, right? There's no shame in that, because it's based on a foundation of a loving relationship of a God who that, like, your identity's not on the line with these things. And so then we go that way, right? Now, the more we refine ourselves, the more we engage in commandments and covenants, we become something more. And as we swing back, we actually find new depths of God's love. Not because he turned up the faucet of his love and he's now willing to give us more of his love, but we've become beings that can absorb more of his love. And the more we go up high on that side of the spectrum, the more we swing back and find more ways to keep his commandments and covenants. Sometimes people say, really, like, you think a cappuccino is really going to keep me out of heaven? Like, it seems like it's such a non-issue. But when you're in this continuum of going back and forth in love and covenants, I like, what else you want me to do, God? Like, I want to do whatever it takes to return to you. He's like, well, don't drink coffee. Great. I'm on board, right? Because I'm in this relationship of love and acceptance. And I know that anything he asks me to do, it'll be for my good, and I'll progress even when I don't understand it. Right. So, and this is what I call repentance, is we're swinging back and forth on this continuum. Some days I just need to sit with maybe a good gospel-centered song and just let the love of God pour over me. Other days I need to dig into President Oak's talk and really unpack, or Elder Christofferson's talk, really unpack this doctrine and understand how I need to change. But it's always done with this gravity of grace, or the foundation of love, and there's no room for shame in that relationship.
I would agree fully with that message, right? It's you've got to know you're loved. You've got to know you're accepted. You've got to know that there's a relationship there no matter what. I think of first of my parents and how they treated me even when I made mistakes. A pretty hard dad. I mean, he's like a Marine, right? Yeah. He's hard, but I mean, unbelievably loving father at the same time. Mm-hmm. He was not going to, he certainly had expectations.
Yeah.
But I always knew, no matter what the situation was, that man loved me.
Yeah.
Always knew that. And that I never swam in any different pool, right, than that. I mean, he was always, I always worked from that scenario. So when I was in trouble, and there were several times where that was the case, I knew I had to change something, but I knew it didn't break my relationship with him.
Right. Yeah. And so many times I see people feel like, I'm just not good enough. Like, why am I even doing this Latter-day Saint dance? Like, I'm out. I'm done. Can't do it. I'm like, whoa. Like, you swallowed some false doctrine somewhere that is not helping you. It's not helping you stay engaged in the gospel. And even, with our mutual friend, Pastor Jeff, as I've explored some of these principles, and this I didn't realize how unique to our faith this is, because I'll ask him, like, well, like, grace, then what? Like, why? It's grace. It's great that we feel grace, but what does that enable us to do? He's like, well, nothing. You're just loved. I'm like, okay, well, yeah, I appreciate that, but like, is there any purpose behind it? And they sort of frame it, and of course I could be wrong on this, but I'll do my best to give them the benefit of the doubt. But you're saved by grace, you feel that love, and naturally you'll just do good things. And we say, no. We feel that love, and it enables us. It gives us strength to do those things, to engage in the covenant, right? And that's why we have, some people look at the temple recommend questions being like, what's the deal with that? Where's the grace there? It's just behavior after behavior after behavior. It's like, well, we need some type of dipstick to pull out of your heart and say, I think your heart's changed. I don't know yet, but according to your behaviors, it appears that way. So let's have you go to the temple to make a deeper covenant. But if we just let everybody go to the temple and start making covenants, they haven't become the people ready to make the covenant, which once they are and they make the covenant, they'll swing back into a deeper loving relationship with our eternal God.
Well, let's go back to that. So we receive God's grace, and then where do we go from there? What does that mean then? Let's expound on that a little bit more, because that is a little bit more of the focus of mainstream Christianity, right? Mm-hmm. It is receive the grace and go to church and be good, but we have a lot more added on to
right. Yeah.
the pathway once we receive that grace.
Yeah. And a lot of, Pastor Jeff sort of shared me his struggles of like, well, it feels like there's suddenly you're involving too much works in there. Like it's just all about grace. And I feel like on both sides of the spectrum, people can get stuck. And sometimes you can get stuck in that grace mode. And with the restored gospel, the new covenant, like is beautiful. Just open that wide open and say, no, there's a whole nother part now that I don't want you to come into the temple to qualify for anything per se. I want you to come into the temple that I can reveal your identity of who you are and who you can become. And that's a very redemptive message. And so we feel that grace.
And I would say build a relationship with me.
Absolutely.
As I always say, it's not the ordinance path. It's
right.
not you're checking a list.
Yeah.
You are making covenants to bind yourself to God.
Yeah.
Right. To have and that binding, what that means is to try to become more like him, to put on the character of God, and to build a relationship with him.
Right. And this is where I've talked with Pastor Jeff about this. So explain to me marriage then. Like, isn't like getting married a form of works? Like, why can't you just like be boyfriend, girlfriend all the time, move in together and do these things? And, there's sort of, there's talks about marriage and that, they should be married and but like, that's all this is for us. It's not like we're doing more works. We just have a ceremony where we say, I want to be more committed to you. And I don't know what that's going to take or what I need to change, but I'm willing to step into that relationship, that covenant relationship, because I know at the end of the day, it's going to turn out well for me. And even on paper, you look at marriage, the tradition of marriage, and a lot of people from a secular viewpoint be like, you guys, your system's broken. Like it doesn't, I don't see so many divorces and like, what's the point? Like, but no, that we do that. We lean into it because it's a divine relationship that we know we can become more. Right. And believe me, I would love the bachelor life. I love my kids, but I've got nieces and nephews where I can figure that part out, but I kind of like to do my own thing, go by the beat of my own drum. Like, why invite like a relationship in there to really muddy the waters? Well, because God invited me. He says, I want you to learn from this relationship so you can learn about our relationship. And being in a relationship with my wife has definitely helped me be in a better relationship with God. And it's a sanctifying process. And so that's one part of I feel like the gospel is just because of the restoration was blown open and further understanding. We're not just Latter-day Saints who do these weird things in these temples. No, we're engaging in a deeper relationship with God. It's beautiful.
It is beautiful. There's no question.
Yeah.
I want to bring up something else that we've talked about before. And, I've got this thing I call teddy bear Jesus.
Oh, yes.
And I feel sometimes we're moving toward that. Well, I do feel we are moving toward that. And, my idea of what a teddy bear Jesus would be something where it is all grace. There are no commandments. There is no judgment. There is no justice. It is simply a God of, I'm going to put my arm around you. I'm going to comfort you. And not only come as you are, which is the right message, but stay as you are. And that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
There's two sides to that. And that to me is, I feel like, especially as we've discussed, for people that really need healing, right? We can say, well, the greatest message for you is that God loves you. And that's probably true. And who you are in your image, right? But to me, and I'm talking from personal experience here, right? To me, the medicine, that's kind of only half the medicine, right? Half the dose. The other dose is beyond just receiving the grace. It is, who can I become? What is the hope for the future? In other words, the faith in Christ, the first of the three major attributes that we're told to follow, faith, hope, and charity. Faith is like putting your faith in the atoning sacrifice. That's where our healing is going to come from, right? It based on whatever wrong we've done or we've been wronged, or whatever else it might be, whatever deep psychological issues or traumatic issues that we have. That is number one, and that's crucial. But there's also hope and charity, right? And hope and charity, to use those, not getting them from God, but developing in them those attributes ourselves. That hope to me is not just a hope that stops at, well, that wound is healed and I'm good now, right? It's a hope in a future. It's a hope in who you can become. It's a hope in a fulfilling existence, a hope in joy that you can get from living a certain life and becoming a certain person and putting on that character of God. And then, of course, the charity, right? Which is not just coming from God, the love of God, but it's you. As you partake of that fruit, which is the love of God, it becomes a part of you. And now, as I love myself and I see a hope in the future, and it is very motivating, I can take that energy and that vision and I can offer even more help to those around me as I have strengthened myself, and serve others, right, with the same thing. And I feel sometimes that teddy bear Jesus is the idea of, well, we're just going to stop at faith.
Yeah, you hear this statement a lot of, the gospel is just about love, right? You just got to love people. And I get that. And is the gospel just about love? Yeah, sure. But people can interpret that differently, where I say, well, the gospel begins with love. And that's the foundation of that love. I mean, you go to, the resurrected Christ when he's having the feed my sheep conversation with Peter, like that. I mean, that's a straight, like, direct conversation with one of his disciples, but it's in a place of Peter knows absolutely that Jesus loves him so much so that he's willing to be like, we're done with the fisherman thing, right? He didn't say like, oh, you love fishing so much, you just keep fishing, man. Bless your heart. No, like, he is inviting him up into a higher covenant, a higher purpose, a higher identity. And if we just say like, oh, the gospel is about love, and we feel like, and again, this is where the dissonance comes, like, well, I know there's these commandments and covenants, but they're kind of harsh. So let's just put our hand over those and just focus on love, because love's beautiful and we can just, just be there. But we're limiting ourselves so much when we close ourselves off to those feed my sheep kind of conversation with God, where he says, you need to change because I love you and I made you something to be entirely different.
Yeah. And again, I think that medicine is feeding the sheep. That part of that healing for yourself is the idea that, oh, I could be someone that could take on that responsibility. And it might be, okay, well, I'm in a fragile position, so I'm afraid of doing that. But the truth is, I think that if you move forward in the gospel and you say, I'm going to take on more responsibility, I mean, to me, there's a lot of medicine there, because that is where the joy and fulfillment comes from. And I feel like in a therapeutic gospel, it's like, oh no, don't, and to a certain degree, fine, but don't talk about responsibility. Don't talk about what they will need to do. Yeah. Or what they can do, or what they it's more just, to me, it locks people into a victim mentality. Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you're not moving beyond just that faith.
Right. And I would admit, like, sometimes we talk past each other, where we agree, but we're just talking past each other, because we're in a world that is just aching for love and grace at times. Like there's so much shame in the world, so much terrible messages that it spreads over everything, even to some of our gospel message. And so it's like I am so hungry for love that can we just stay there forever? Like I need to fill up my tank for a long time here. And then we think, oh yeah, that other part is just not too much. I don't need that. I'm not even going to think about that right now because it triggers me or whatever it is, right? But no, there's a higher law, a higher relationship with God. And I talk about this. There's this sort of arbitrary Hebrew translation of the word righteousness as right relationship. And, because righteousness is throughout the scriptures, right? And this encouragement to be righteousness. But if you take out and replace that with right relationship, that we know we're righteous when we're in a relationship with God. Like to me, that's so encouraging. Even when I mess up, I think, well, I'm still aiming for a right relationship with God. I'm still aiming for righteousness. And so that right relationship with God includes that medicine you talk of like, all right, tomorrow we're going to do better. Because you know what, Kurt, you are the type of person who can keep every commandment that I give you. Every covenant, I wouldn't have given it to you if I didn't believe in you. So here we go. We're going to try one more time. Take that sacrament and reset, and we're going to go again.
Yeah, I like that. Talk about how you frame commandments again. I know you touched on this a little bit, but you talk about commandments and worth as an individual. But expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, so, even you think of the scripture, like, if ye love me, keep my commandments, right there. I mean, Kurt, that's dripping with expectation, right? And we often frame it in a way of like God's sort of this person in the relationship that's just sort of like you better keep my commandments or you don't love me. Oh, you didn't keep my commandments. I guess that proves you don't love me. Like that again, full of shame. Like we're framing it wrong.
Yeah.
But if I love God and I love him because, as we know, he first loved us. He loved me, that foundation. And so, of course, I love him. And so he says, then keep my commandments. Now, we interpret that more in like a behavior thing. So then if you love me, do all the things, do everything I tell you to do. Well,
check all the boxes.
Yeah, exactly. And I love our doctrine of tokens, right? It's almost as if God gives us a token, a commandment, a covenant, and says, okay, whatever happens in life, just keep it. Just hold on to my commandments. So if you love me, hold on to my commandments. If you love me, don't quit. If you love me, just keep going. Don't drop that covenant. And too often with the bad interpretation of that dynamic, people think, well, I can't do it, so I might as well drop it. Like, well, no, you're supposed to just keep it. He didn't say, do everything perfect or else. No, just keep it. Right. And so to me, that's just a more encouraging framing of, yeah, covenants and commandments are crucial to your development. Just don't let them go.
Yeah. Talking about Hebrew, going back to Hebrew, along those lines, there is, when you talk about keep, it is also guard.
Yeah, guard. Like Spanish translation, right?
Yeah, the guard or preserve.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You're saying, hold on to it. You're preserving that. In fact, it's interesting because Jews don't call us Christians. I mean, they will in English, but in Hebrew, they call us the keepers.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Or the preserved ones, or those that preserve. So that's kind of, it's Nozraim. Nozraim is the word they still use today for Christians. It's those that the keepers almost.
Yeah, and to me, I interpret that as we're the people that don't give up. Right? We keep hold on it, and today was tough. Tomorrow's maybe tougher, but I'm not going to let go of this covenant.
Okay, so that's a reframing of commandments. What about sin? How would you frame sin? Talk about sin a little bit.
Right. So, and this is the thing when people think, okay, here's this quack on this podcast here telling me that God doesn't have expectations, and it can be interpreted like I'm sort of like, let's not talk about sin. Like it's not a big deal. Let's just dismiss it. Like, it's uncomfortable talking about that. But let me be very, very clear that sin will destroy you. Like we need, and it doesn't matter who in my circle of influence, friends, family, LGBT brothers and sisters, addicts, like whoever, if anybody comes to me and says, Kurt, like life is so hard, I don't know what to do. Every time, no matter what the circumstance, my answer will be the same. And it is, turn to Jesus, like come unto him and repent. Like I promise you, it might be a more intense experience, but it's going to be so worth it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so with sin, like sin will destroy you. And really, we frame it, sin as like, well, sin is anytime you break a commandment. It's a very behavioral framing of it. But sin happens anytime you turn away from God. Anytime, and some sins are more stigmatized, right? So we think, Johnny's really struggling with pornography. And there's such a heavy stigma with pornography that we think, man, if he could only figure it out. But we all numb in some way, which turns us from God. When we don't go to God as the answer to everything every ill and immortality, then we are sinning. Like he is the answer. Now, there's a lot of nuance in this, right? Where some people have a hard day of work. I just can't wait to go home and binge on some streaming service and just forget I exist for a couple hours. Like, again, there's nothing wrong with watching movies. There's nothing wrong with binging a good series. But if we're doing it to cope with life, that's a sin. We've turned from God, right? It's not stigmatized. I'll stand up in elders quorum and say, oh, has anybody seen this, this series? And it's so good. But again, if we're doing it in our hearts to numb out, like that's sin. So anytime we turn to God, and now this introduces our earlier discussion of guilt. When we feel guilt, I don't see guilt as some sort of tool that God's like prodding us with, like, oh, you did something bad, I'm going to poke you with the guilt stick for a while until you change your ways. Guilt is the natural experience we have whenever we turn from God. And there will be something in our soul that is always drawing us back. I feel a little distance. I'm out of sorts. Like, I feel so guilty. Well,
do think that guilt has a positive element to it.
Yeah. And guilt and shame are different. Okay. Absolutely. And there is a role for guilt, but my contention is I don't think guilt is like a tool that God's like inflicting upon us. It's this natural experience of turning away from God that we can't exist there. So we'll either have to numb it, cope with life in a different way. And that's what leads to maybe more stigmatized sin of like, I just had an argument with my wife. This dissonance, I need reprieve. I need redemption. I'll just look at pornography and I can have other feelings that numb me out that way. Well, again, that's sin. Obviously it leads to sin. So guilt is any experience, the natural experience we have when we turn from God and look towards any other answer but God.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And that again goes against a lot of what the therapeutic gospel would say, and a lot of what counseling is now giving, which is if you feel guilt, that's the worst thing in the world. And therefore, how do we either put your head in the sand,
right,
or go after those where you seem to be getting the guilt from, which could be shame, but it might not be, right?
Yeah, or they'll
getting from someone else. It's more of a feeling of I'm not doing the right thing, or it's your religion, and therefore your religion is what is guilting you into these things. And I like that. It's more of if you're turning away from God, there is going to be a natural consequence that is going to exist.
Yeah. And many times they'll try to remove the stigma of it. Like, hey, a little porn helps. Go ahead. Like whatever you got to do to survive or cope or do these things. Now, that doesn't mean I like turning to God means I'm like reading my scriptures or I'm like meditating and I'm but many times it's like, I need to escape from life and go to God. Well, what did Moses do? He went into the mountains. What does that mean for us? We go to the temple or maybe we go to the actual mountains. And, I've had one guy tell me when I'm fly fishing, I've never felt closer to God. I'm like, sounds like you need to fly fish a whole lot more because there's something refreshing about your soul where you can just unplug, reconnect with God, reconnect with nature that God created. And that's how we turn to him and avoid that guilt.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Well, Kurt, anything else you want to add on the book before say goodbye here?
So much heresy in the book. I encourage you to check it out. But no, and again, this is a thought exercise. I may get to the other side and gotta be like, oh, Kurt, that was such a cute book you wrote, but I've been perpetually disappointed in you. But for me, I'll be like, you know what, God? Maybe I had it all wrong, but this kept me engaged in the gospel. And I just couldn't think of you as somebody who was shaming me and attacking my divine identity or wanting me to feel like I was less than I am. So it kept me engaged. Like, okay, great. I'm glad you wrote the book. Right. So definitely engage with it. I hope it just gets you thinking. I'm not trying to win you over to my way of thinking or framing the gospel, but it was fun to write. And I often say it's one thing to know the gospel. It's a whole other thing to articulate the gospel. And it was a great exercise for me to do that.
That's
so
true.
check
Well,
it out.
I really liked it. So audience, go out and grab it. I'll put the link in the description box on the YouTube channel. So Kurt, thanks again. It was really good seeing you last week or the week before. Can't remember now,
it was fun to hang out.
appreciate you coming on.
See ya.